Dignity does not break in silence. It breaks the man who mistakes restraint for surrender. The morning at Harrow Harbor smelled of polished cedar, cold salt air, and chilled Bordeaux, uncorked too early by people who called excess tradition instead of arrogance. Gentle waves tapped against the carbon hull of the newly refitted yacht, each sound soft enough to seem elegant, each one expensive enough to remind everyone watching that ordinary rules rarely reached this side of the marina. Above the main deck, a white canvas veil covered the freshly painted name, tied with silver cord beneath floodlights that made the vessel gleam like a private kingdom waiting to be crowned. Serena Blackwell did not hurry. She arrived in a tailored charcoal dress that moved quietly in the sea wind, her posture straight, her face calm, her eyes steady in the way that made nervous people mistake restraint for weakness. Around her, brokers in navy suits lowered their voices, ship captains adjusted their cuffs, and two insurance executives pretended not to notice a wife being replaced inside a performance of wealth. Sterling Harrow stood near the bow with Lydia Brandt at his side, one hand resting lightly against the small of her back as if the gesture itself were a legal document. He wanted an audience. Lydia's blonde hair was arranged in perfect loose waves, her smile bright with borrowed ownership, her white dress catching the morning light as though she had been styled to replace not only a wife, but a legacy. Sterling lifted a champagne flute and spoke about renewal, about fresh beginnings, about beauty deserving a name worthy of the future. Everyone understood. The crew pulled the silver cord, and the canvas dropped in one clean, theatrical sweep, revealing Lydia's name painted across the yacht's flank in dark polished letters. For one breath, the marina held still. Then came the polite applause of people rich enough to recognize cruelty and cautious enough not to interrupt it. Sterling turned slightly, not toward the yacht, but toward Serena, waiting for the crack in her expression, the tremor in her mouth, the humiliation he believed money had finally purchased. Serena looked at the name. She looked at Lydia. Then her gaze lowered, not to the champagne, not to Sterling's hand, not to the crowd's careful faces, but to a small metal builder's plate fixed near the lower hull, nearly invisible beneath the shine. That was where ownership stopped being decoration and became control. Sterling mistook her silence for defeat and smiled wider, telling the crowd the yacht had always needed a name with more life in it, a name that represented passion instead of old obligations. Lydia laughed softly, as if she had been handed a throne instead of a scandal. A gull cut across the gray sky above them, and somewhere inside the dry dock, a chain shifted with a hard metallic echo. Serena finally moved. She stepped forward just enough for the nearest executives to fall silent, her calm so complete it seemed to pull the noise out of the harbor. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask for the canvas to be put back. She did not even look wounded, which frightened Sterling more than anger would have. Her eyes remained on the builder's plate. Then she said, quietly enough that people leaned in to hear her, "You should have checked who authorizes the launch." Sterling laughed because he thought it was the kind of sentence a humiliated woman used when she had nothing left but pride. Lydia tilted her chin, still smiling, still standing beside a name that had suddenly begun to feel less like a victory and more like evidence. At the edge of the crowd, Malcolm Greaves, the shipyard's senior maritime counsel, stepped out from beside the glass office overlooking the dock, carrying a slim gray envelope and wearing the expression of a man who had not come to argue. He had come to confirm. Serena turned away from the painted name as if it no longer interested her. The vessel remained beautiful, enormous, and trapped above the water, its hull shining under the cold harbor light. Sterling thought he had renamed a yacht. Serena knew he had just revealed the one thing he had never bothered to understand. The yard, not the paint, decided what was allowed to meet the sea. Sterling Harrow had built his public life on the belief that beautiful objects obeyed the man who paid for them. His office overlooked the harbor from a tower of smoked glass, where models of yachts sat beneath museum lighting, and every wall photograph showed him beside something larger than ordinary men could afford. He liked acquisitions with clean lines, polished decks, quiet crews, and names that sounded like destiny. He liked being obeyed. For years, Serena had stood beside him at launch ceremonies, charity regattas, and closed-door investor luncheons where men discussed shipping corridors, marina leases, and luxury berths as if they were discussing weather. Sterling introduced her with practiced warmth, calling her elegant, brilliant, indispensable, then speaking over her before anyone could ask what she actually knew. He treated her silence as decoration. It was not. Serena listened when bankers mentioned debt covenants after the second glass of Bordeaux. She listened when captains complained about maintenance delays, when lawyers softened dangerous clauses with polite smiles, when shipyard managers described shortages that Sterling dismissed as operational noise. She remembered everything. Sterling did not. He saw the shipyard as background machinery, useful only because it made his indulgences float. He liked the finished decks, the champagne locker, the carbon hull, the cedar-lined owner's suite, the sound of waves touching something that belonged to him. He never cared for the dry dock. Serena did. She understood that luxury had a skeleton, and the skeleton was never invited to the party. Behind every gleaming yacht stood steel beams, insurance certificates, union schedules, registration authorities, environmental permits, inspection stamps, and men in hard hats who knew exactly which billionaire paid late and which one paid attention. Sterling paid loudly. Serena paid attention. That difference had saved Harrow Shipworks once, though Sterling had never told the story correctly. He told people he had kept the yard alive because the phrase sounded good beside a cigar in a harbor view. In truth, when the shipyard nearly collapsed under old debt and delayed contracts, Sterling had wanted to abandon it for a flashier European builder with a prettier brochure. Serena had asked to see the books. Nothing more. The accountants had looked at Sterling first, as if a wife needed permission to read numbers connected to her own future. Sterling had waved his hand, amused, indulgent, careless, and said she enjoyed details. That was his mistake. Inside those details, Serena found more than debt. She found rare licenses, protected waterfront access, grandfather drydock rights, trained craftsmen no competitor could buy quickly, and a maintenance network that quietly controlled half the private fleets Sterling used to impress people. She saw the empire beneath the emblem. Sterling saw expenses. So when she arranged the restructuring, he signed because she presented it cleanly, because the tax treatment pleased him, because the board liked the stability, and because he enjoyed telling people his wife was wonderful with paperwork. He never asked why several control provisions required her separate authorization. He never wondered why reputation clauses were tied to vessel use, ownership conduct, and public impairment of asset value. He never noticed the trap because it was written in language he considered beneath him. Now, on the harbor, with Lydia's name still wet looking on the hull, that old arrogance returned to claim him. Malcolm Greaves approached with the gray envelope, and Sterling's smile thinned as if legal paper were an insult to sunlight. "This is a private celebration," Sterling said. Serena looked at him once. It was. The two words landed more heavily than accusation. Sterling turned back to the crowd, trying to recover the room he no longer controlled, but the harbor had changed temperature around him. The captains were no longer looking at the painted name. The brokers were looking at Malcolm's envelope. Lydia's smile flickered, small and fast, the first crack in borrowed confidence. Serena stood still beside the rail, composed enough to make the entire scene feel suddenly procedural. Sterling had spent years mistaking her restraint for absence. That morning, absence became authority. Malcolm Greaves stopped 3 steps from Sterling, close enough for the envelope in his hand to become visible and far enough to make clear he was not asking permission. He was a narrow man in a dark maritime suit, silver at the temples, with the stillness of someone who had spent decades watching rich men confuse volume with authority. Behind him, the glass office of the shipyard reflected the yacht, the crowd, the painted name, and Serena standing like the only fixed point in a scene beginning to tilt. The harbor went quiet. Sterling gave a short laugh, the kind he used in boardrooms when he wanted subordinates to remember their salaries. He glanced at the captains, then at the brokers, then at the insurance men as if searching for an audience willing to restore his importance. No one moved quickly enough. "Malcolm," Sterling said, stretching the name with public familiarity, "whatever this is can wait until after launch." Malcolm did not smile. He opened the gray envelope and removed 3 documents, each clipped, stamped, and clean enough to look harmless to anyone who had never been ruined by paper. The first was a dry dock hold confirmation. The second was a pending maritime lien notice. The third was an unsigned vessel naming authorization with 1 blank line circled in blue. Sterling's face hardened. Lydia leaned closer to the hull, as if proximity to her own painted name might protect her from the paperwork gathering in Malcolm's hands. Serena watched the documents, not the mistress. Malcolm placed the pages on a polished service table beside the champagne bucket, turning a celebration station into a legal desk with one quiet motion. The sound of paper against teak was small, but everyone heard it. Sterling's jaw shifted. "That vessel is mine," he said. Serena answered without raising her voice. "Not today." It was not an argument. It was a legal condition. Sterling's nostrils flared, and for the first time that morning, his confidence looked less like authority and more like a costume struggling against the wind. He pointed toward the yacht, toward the fresh lettering, toward the crew waiting near the gangway. "I paid for her refit, her engines, her berth, her crew, and every inch of that hull." Malcolm nodded once, almost kindly, as if none of those facts mattered in the way Sterling needed them to matter. "You paid invoices, Mr. Harrow. You did not clear authorization." The brokers exchanged a look. One of the insurance executives touched his phone but did not make a call. The thud of rigging against a mast sounded somewhere farther down the marina, slow and hollow, like a clock beginning to announce consequences. Sterling looked at Serena again, waiting for emotion he could attack. She gave him none. Years earlier, when the shipyard's accounts had bled quietly beneath Sterling's polished empire, Serena had sat alone in the old records room while rain struck the high windows and the smell of wet steel mixed with machine oil. She had read every contract Sterling dismissed as maintenance clutter. She had noticed the expired credit protections, the undervalued waterfront rights, the insurance dependencies, the labor agreements, the environmental permits, and the dry dock licenses that could not be replaced if lost. She had found the shipyard's real worth in the things rich men forgot to photograph. Then she rebuilt it. Not with speeches, not with threats, not with a demand to be admired, but with voting units, secured debt conversions, reputation clauses, asset protection covenants, and one quiet authorization structure that required her signature before any flagship tied to the Harrow marital estate could be released after material alteration. Sterling had signed all of it. He signed because the room was warm, the coffee was expensive, the lawyers were deferential, and Serena had placed the documents in front of him without drama. He signed because he believed paperwork existed to confirm what he already owned. That belief had aged poorly. Back on the dock, Malcolm tapped the blank line on the naming authorization. This change was never approved. Lydia's mouth opened, then closed, her painted confidence shrinking beneath the morning light. Sterling's voice dropped, dangerous and embarrassed. "Serena, fix this." Serena looked at the name on the hull one last time. "I already did." Sterling heard Serena's 3 words as defiance because he had never learned to recognize completion. His eyes moved from her face to Malcolm's documents, then to the yacht, then to Lydia, whose hand had slipped from his arm without her seeming to notice. The celebration around him was still dressed in wealth, still arranged with flowers, chilled champagne, polished teak, and photographers waiting for permission to capture triumph. But triumph had left first. Lydia Brandt had entered Sterling's world as if luxury were a language she had always been born to speak. She learned quickly which crew members lowered their eyes, which doors opened without a key, which tables were held even when fully booked, and which phrases made older rich men feel young enough to be reckless. She called the yacht "ours" after her 3rd weekend aboard. No one corrected her. At first, Sterling enjoyed the little trespasses because each one felt like proof that his old life was becoming optional. Lydia sat in Serena's usual chair on the aft deck, touched the cedar paneling with manicured fingers, asked whether the owner's suite could be made less formal, and laughed when Sterling said formality was something wives invented to protect boredom. He mistook vulgarity for freedom. Serena had noticed Lydia long before Lydia noticed her. She noticed the perfume left in the corridor outside the owner's cabin, the wrong initials on a guest preference sheet, the rewritten seating plan for a marine investor's lunch, and the new tone in Sterling's messages whenever he wanted something shameful to sound administrative. She did not ask questions she already knew the answers to. That was discipline. Sterling's decision to rename the vessel had not begun as strategy. It began as vanity, whispered over lunch on deck, while Lydia complained that the old name sounded cold and married. Sterling laughed. then ordered the refit team to prepare a new design as if changing a name were the same as changing flowers in a dining room. The shipyard manager asked for authorization. Sterling dismissed him. Lydia suggested a public reveal. Sterling approved it within the hour. Every step gave Serena more evidence without requiring her to lift a finger. By the time invitations were sent, the legal structure had already begun moving beneath the surface like tide under a dock. Malcolm's office received the refit request. The naming certificate remained incomplete. The dry dock release was quietly suspended for final review. The insurer requested confirmation. The old reputation clause, ignored for years, woke up exactly as Serena had written it to do. Sterling had staged a humiliation and walked it into a contract trigger. Now Lydia stood beside the painted name, beginning to understand that borrowed privilege does not survive contact with ownership. She looked at Sterling, waiting for him to laugh again, to make a call, to produce the invisible authority she had been promised came with him everywhere. Sterling reached for his phone. Malcolm spoke before he could dial. "Your calls will not alter the hold." The sentence cut cleanly through the harbor air. Sterling's thumb froze above the screen. Serena remained still. A photographer lowered his camera. One of the brokers stepped away from the champagne table and murmured something to an assistant about postponing the buyer preview. That was how collapse began in Serena's world, not with screaming, but with professionals quietly protecting themselves from a man who had become a liability. Sterling turned on Malcolm, his voice polished but tight, and asked whether the shipyard had forgotten who kept its lights on. Malcolm looked toward Serena. No, the answer was short enough to bruise. Sterling followed his gaze, and for the first time that morning, he saw not his wife, not his ornament, not the woman he had expected to embarrass, but the final signature standing in front of him. Serena adjusted one cuff at her wrist, not out of nerves, but because there was nothing left to perform. Lydia swallowed. The wind lifted the edge of the fallen canvas at their feet. Across the hull, her name gleamed beautifully, uselessly, trapped on a vessel that could not move. Sterling Harrow had always believed public rooms could be bent back into shape if he spoke with enough confidence. He turned from Malcolm to the gathered guests with the practiced expression of a man who expected embarrassment to pass through other people, never him. Behind his smile, however, the dock had already begun rearranging its loyalties, and every polished face in the marina was calculating distance. The silence was no longer Serena's alone. A senior broker near the gangway whispered into his phone and used the words, "pending clearance," with the careful softness of a man avoiding association with a failed launch. The captain stood with his hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the dry dock gate rather than on Sterling, waiting for written authority instead of a billionaire's temper. Two insurance representatives stepped aside beneath the shade canopy, their voices low, their tablets angled away from photographers. Wealth was still present. Trust was leaving. Sterling saw the movement and mistook it for hesitation he could correct. He lifted his chin, straightened his jacket, and announced that the event would continue after a minor clerical delay. Lydia tried to smile at the crowd, but her mouth had lost its brightness, and the name on the hull behind her now looked less like a tribute than a mistake too large to hide. A gull cried over the water, sharp and ugly. Serena did not rescue him from the moment. Malcolm placed one more page on the teak table, a document bearing the shipyard seal and the exact time of suspension. It named the vessel by its original registration number, not by the fresh paint Sterling had paid for, and that detail landed harder than an insult. Lydia noticed first. Her eyes moved from the document to the letters on the hull, then back again, as if legal reality had refused to learn her name. Sterling's voice lowered. "This is theatrical." Serena answered, "It is recorded." The phrase moved through the dock with quiet force. Recorded meant the insurer had it. Recorded meant the shipyard had it. Recorded meant the attempted change was no longer a private humiliation, but a documented act tied to contract, ownership, and asset impairment. Sterling's hand tightened around his phone until his knuckles paled. The people who had applauded minutes earlier now examined their shoes, their watches, the water, anything except the man who had invited them to witness his victory. That was the cruelty of elite circles. They rarely defended dignity, but they always recognized risk. A maritime banker who had once laughed too loudly at Sterling's jokes stepped backward and murmured that his office would need to review exposure before confirming the next fleet line. A refit supplier quietly closed the glossy proposal packet meant for future contracts. The photographer who had been hired to immortalize Lydia's reveal began deleting preview shots from his camera display. No one announced betrayal. They simply adjusted. Sterling looked around and realized the crowd had not turned against him morally. It had turned against him financially, which frightened him more. He snapped at the captain to prepare the crew. The captain did not move. Malcolm's voice remained level. No release order has been issued. Sterling pointed toward the water beyond the dry dock, where the harbor glittered open and uselessly near. She is ready. Serena looked at the suspended vessel. Not cleared. 2 words. Final enough. The deckhands lowered their eyes, not in shame for Serena, but in obedience to procedure. Lydia's shoulders stiffened as the logic of borrowed status finished closing around her. The yacht could carry her name, but not her authority. It could display her vanity, but not her legitimacy. It could shine in front of witnesses, but it could not cross the threshold into the sea. Sterling stepped closer to Serena, lowering his voice as if intimacy might restore control. He told her not to humiliate him in front of his partners. She looked at him with the calm of a woman who had survived the insult before the audience understood there was one. You invited them. The sentence left him nowhere to stand. Behind him, the first guest departed without saying goodbye, then another, then 2 more, their expensive shoes tapping along the dockboards with discreet urgency. The sound was softer than applause and far more devastating. Sterling remained beside the champagne, the painted name, and the woman he had elevated into evidence, while Serena stood in the same place she had occupied from the beginning, quiet, upright, untouched by the performance collapsing around her. Sterling did not chase the departing guests because chasing would have admitted they were leaving. Instead, he stood very still beside the champagne table, wearing the hard smile of a man trying to make collapse look like strategy. The harbor wind pressed lightly against his suit, and behind him, Lydia's name remained bright on the hull, elegant, expensive, and increasingly obscene. It had become the largest mistake in the marina. Malcolm Greaves gathered the documents into a precise stack, then removed a second packet from inside his jacket, thicker than the first and bound with a plain steel clip. Sterling saw the weight of it and flinched before he could stop himself. He hated paper when it arrived, already organized. Malcolm placed the packet beside the untouched champagne flutes and turned the first page toward Sterling. At the top was the shipyard's operating structure, revised 3 years earlier, with voting control, emergency authority, asset protection provisions, and reputation-based enforcement rights listed in clean legal language. Sterling stared at the page as if the words had appeared there only to betray him. They had been waiting. The memory came back unevenly. A winter afternoon in his harbor office, rain striking the floor-to-ceiling glass, expensive coffee cooling beside a row of signature tabs, Serena sitting across from him with calm hands folded near the documents. He had been on a call about a resort acquisition, half listening, half irritated by the length of the meeting. Serena had told him the shipyard needed a stronger protection structure. He had signed without reading. At the time, he thought it made him efficient. Now efficiency looked like surrender in advance. Malcolm tapped one clause with his index finger, not dramatically, simply accurately. Public misuse of jointly connected maritime assets triggers review authority. Sterling's mouth tightened. That was meant for fraud. Serena looked at him. It includes conduct. The answer was so short that it gave him nothing to twist. Sterling tried again, reaching for the old rhythm of dominance, saying that a name painted on a hull did not damage asset value, that personal matters did not belong in corporate structures, that he would have the board overturn this within an hour. Malcolm turned another page. The board has acknowledged the trigger. That sentence changed the air more than any shout could have. Lydia stepped back from the hull, as if the painted letters had become hot. The captain glanced once toward Serena, then returned his eyes to the dry dock gate, waiting for the only authority that mattered now. Across the dock, the remaining partners lowered their voices into a professional murmur, the language of men quietly surviving someone else's disaster. Sterling reached for his phone again and called the chairman of the Marine Holdings Board. It rang 4 times. No answer. He called the banker. Voicemail. He called the fleet operations director. Declined. Each silence stripped him cleaner than an accusation. Serena did not watch him dial. She watched the water beyond the dock, the open channel glittering just beyond the locked path of the yacht. Sterling finally turned on her, his face flushed beneath the practiced tan, and demanded that she tell Malcolm to lift the hold. He did not ask. He ordered. Serena's expression did not change. No, one word ended more than the launch. Malcolm continued with the cruelty of procedure, explaining that the launch checklist had been closed. The harbor authority notification had not been released. The insurer had placed the vessel under review, and all Harrow Fleet requests would now require written clearance before refit, movement, or emergency scheduling. Outstanding service balances would no longer receive courtesy extensions. Priority engineers would not be reassigned. Drydock access would not be advanced. Courtesy had been revoked. Sterling looked as if someone had struck him, though no one had touched him. For a man like him, privilege had never felt like privilege until it disappeared. The crew did not run to fix his embarrassment. The lawyers did not soften the language. The gate did not open. Lydia whispered his name, but there was no confidence left in it. Only the thin panic of a woman realizing she had been handed visibility without protection. Serena turned toward Malcolm. Proceed. Malcolm nodded, and with that single word from her, the entire shipyard began moving around Sterling without moving for him. A dock supervisor closed the launch checklist. A technician removed the ceremonial ropes. The photographer packed his camera. The champagne remained sweating in silver buckets, untouched and absurd. Sterling stood in the center of it all, surrounded by the cost of being obeyed for too long. The shipyard began to obey Serena with the quiet precision of a place returning to its rightful center. No one rushed, no one shouted, and no one made a display of loyalty. Yet every small motion on the dock confirmed that Sterling's authority had already been removed from circulation. A supervisor clipped a red hold tag to the launch board. A technician locked the drydock release panel, and two crew members stepped away from the gangway without looking back at the man who had once treated movement as something his money commanded. Authority had changed hands without raising its voice. Sterling watched the process with growing disbelief, his face caught between fury and calculation, searching for the hidden lever he could still pull. He had spent decades learning how to buy urgency. Double the fee, call the chairman, threaten litigation, replace the vendor, summon a driver, demand a private room, turn inconvenience into someone else's emergency. But the shipyard did not react like a hotel, a club, or a concierge desk. It had rules. Malcolm opened the thicker packet to a page marked with corporate seals, voting schedules, and a transfer provision Sterling had once initialed beside a blue tab. The document identified Serena Blackwell as controlling director of the Maritime Industrial Trust that held the shipyard's decisive voting block. It also listed emergency authority over drydock release, naming approvals, refit priority, insurance clearance, and conduct-related asset holds. The language was clean enough to look ordinary. That made it lethal. Lydia read only enough to understand that Serena had never been standing outside the Empire looking in. Serena was the architecture. Sterling's breathing grew louder, though the harbor remained almost reverent in its stillness. He leaned toward Malcolm and said the trust had been a temporary structure, a tax arrangement, a protective shell, nothing more. Malcolm turned one page. It became active last night. Sterling's eyes snapped to Serena. She did not look away. At midnight. The two words struck harder than a confession because they were not offered as one. At midnight, while Sterling had approved flowers, champagne, and photographers, Serena had executed the ownership transition the moment his conduct triggered the final clause. At midnight, while Lydia had likely rehearsed her smile for the reveal, the shipyard's voting control had moved fully into Serena's hands. At midnight, before the painted letters ever met the morning light, the outcome had already been decided. Sterling had arrived at his own defeat late. He grabbed the top page and scanned it with the frantic impatience of a man reading consequences after signature. His name appeared repeatedly, but never where he needed it. His initials sat beside clauses he did not remember, dates he had ignored, authorizations he had delegated, and conduct thresholds he had assumed would apply to lesser men. Every line was familiar enough to be undeniable and distant enough to feel like betrayal. He had done this to himself in ink. Lydia's voice finally entered the silence, small and sharp, asking Sterling whether Serena could really stop the yacht from leaving. Sterling did not answer because answering would have made him smaller in front of her. Malcolm answered instead. She already has. The sentence made Lydia take another step back. Her name remained on the hull, but now it looked stranded there, a decoration attached to something she could not enter, move, sell, charter, rename, or claim. The humiliation she had helped stage had reversed direction so completely that even her beauty seemed overlit and unprotected beneath the pale harbor sun. Sterling turned to Serena with anger polished into a plea. He said they could discuss this privately. Serena looked at the documents in his hand. We did. For a moment, he did not understand. Then he remembered every dinner where she had warned him about asset exposure, every meeting where she had asked him not to use jointly connected property as a personal weapon, every quiet sentence he had dismissed because it came without tears. He remembered ignoring her. That memory had witnesses now. The last cluster of guests began to leave, not abruptly, but with the smooth discipline of people exiting a sinking reputation. A banker nodded to Serena before stepping away. The captain removed Sterling's name from the immediate launch chain on his tablet. A shipyard guard closed the access rope in front of Lydia, as gently as if closing a curtain. No one touched Sterling. No one needed to. Serena took the signed confirmation from Malcolm and placed her initials on the final line with a plain steel pen offered from the service desk. Not a luxury object, not a symbol, just an instrument that worked. The dry dock hold became permanent pending review. Sterling stared at the mark of her initials, and the full shape of his loss finally reached him. He had tried to make Serena watch another woman receive a name. Instead, everyone watched Serena reclaim the system that made names matter. Sterling tried litigation next because men like him often mistook threat for remedy. He told Malcolm that every document on the table would be challenged, that every director who acknowledged Serena's authority would be removed, that every supplier who delayed his fleet would regret choosing procedure over relationship. The words were large, polished, and increasingly useless. Malcolm listened as if recording weather. Across the dock, the shipyard had resumed its ordinary rhythm, which made Sterling's fury look even smaller. A lift horn sounded near the service bay, welders moved behind tinted safety glass, and a clerk removed Lydia's reveal schedule from the event board without ceremony. The world went on. That was the insult Sterling could not bear. He had expected disaster to pause out of respect for him, for cameras to remain, for staff to tremble, for Serena to negotiate under the pressure of his embarrassment. Instead, the shipyard treated him like a suspended account. His yacht remained elevated, blocked, silent, and beautiful in the cruelest possible way. Lydia stood near the velvet rope with her arms folded, no longer touching the hull, no longer touching Sterling, no longer smiling for anyone. She had come to the marina expecting to become a symbol of arrival, the woman whose name crossed the water with a billionaire's blessing. Now she was trapped beside a painted mistake that could not legally leave land. Even vanity needs a vessel that can move. Sterling saw her distance and snapped that she should wait in the owner's lounge. Malcolm looked up from the documents. Access has been restricted. Lydia blinked. Sterling's face flushed deeper. She is my guest. Serena answered without looking at Lydia. Not here. The sentence did not insult. It classified. A guard at the private access door lowered his eyes respectfully, but he did not open it. Lydia's mouth tightened as the meaning settled over her. She could be photographed beside the vessel, but she could not enter the protected spaces attached to its ownership, maintenance records, or operating authority. Her borrowed world ended at the rope. Sterling stepped toward the access door himself, and for the first time in years, someone in a uniform did not move aside quickly enough. The guard did not block him with force. He simply stood where policy placed him. Sterling stopped because walking through would have turned humiliation into trespass. The restraint cost him visibly. Serena watched the scene without triumph. Her stillness had never been passive, but now it became almost merciful, giving Sterling no emotional outburst to blame, no jealous scene to retell, no scandalous quote to leak through friendly media. She let the facts speak until even his excuses sounded decorative. Malcolm handed Sterling a notice of suspended fleet privileges, listing every vessel connected to the Harrow private fleet and every shipyard service now requiring board review. Emergency dry dock priority, suspended. Courtesy credit, suspended. Naming change clearance, suspended. Launch approval, suspended. Preferred owner access, suspended. Privilege disappeared line by line. Sterling read the list, and each item stripped away a private luxury he had mistaken for identity. No midnight repairs before a Monaco crossing. No instant crew reassignment. No quiet invoice delays. No engineer pulled from another client because he raised his voice. No protected lounge where humiliation could be hidden behind smoked glass and chilled Bordeaux. Just forms, deadlines, balances, signatures, and waiting. He had become a customer. Serena turned slightly toward the water, where the harbor lay open and indifferent beyond the locked dry dock gate. Sterling followed her gaze and understood the cruelty of proximity. The sea was right there, shining beneath the morning haze, but his vessel could not touch it. The woman whose name marked the hull could not board it. The man who paid for the paint could not move it. Malcolm closed the packet. The review board convenes tomorrow. Sterling forced out a laugh that convinced no one. And until then, Serena looked at the yacht once, then at him. It stays. The short answer settled over the dock like a final weather report. Lydia turned away first, heels tapping against the boards as she walked toward the parking area without waiting for Sterling. A few remaining staff watched without watching, trained in the discretion of expensive collapse. Sterling stayed where he was, surrounded by locked access, cooling champagne, and a name that had become evidence of his own miscalculation. Serena did not remove the paint. She did not need to. The greater punishment was letting him stare at it while everything beneath it belonged to her. By late afternoon, the marina had lost its audience and gained its truth. The flowers from the morning reveal sagged in the salt air. The champagne buckets held more melted ice than celebration, and the white canvas that had once hidden Lydia's name lay folded near a service card, like a discarded costume from a performance no one wanted to remember. Sterling Harrow remained on the dock because leaving would have required accepting that there was nothing left to command. Across the yard, Serena signed the final transfer documents inside the glass-walled office overlooking the dry dock. Not with ceremony, not with rage, but with the quiet efficiency of a woman finishing work that had started long before the insult. Malcolm Greaves stood beside her, reviewing each page before passing it across the desk. While the new operating board confirmed temporary controls over the fleet, the shipyard, the service contracts, and every privileged access Sterling had once treated as birthright. The empire did not collapse loudly. It changed hands one signature at a time. Outside, Sterling watched through the glass as people who used to wait for his approval now waited for Serena's. The dry dock supervisor brought her the revised launch schedule. The insurance liaison asked whether the suspended vessel should remain under asset hold. The captain sent his next report to Malcolm instead of Sterling. Each small act was a door closing. Lydia had already left, her departure as quiet as her arrival had been theatrical, and the painted name she left behind now looked almost cruel in the fading light. It remained there across the hull, glossy and perfect, but without authority, without access, without motion. Sterling finally walked into the office as the last document was sealed, his face drained of its morning arrogance, but still fighting for one final piece of pride. He looked at Serena, then at Malcolm, then at the document stack that had converted humiliation into ownership. "You cannot keep everything," he said, his voice lower now, less certain. Serena stood with the same calm posture she had carried on the dock, not as a wife begging to be valued, but as the controlling authority of the place he had underestimated. For a moment, the only sound was the soft strike of waves against the trapped hull outside. Then she said, "You painted her name on the yacht because you thought status was display. I own the yard because I knew authority was permission." Sterling had no answer. The sentence stripped him more completely than accusation could have, because it did not ask him to feel guilty. It required him to understand that he had mistaken visibility for control. Serena turned from him and walked out of the office, past the locked access gate, past the silent crew, past the vessel that would remain in dry dock until her review board allowed otherwise. She did not look back at Lydia's name. She did not need to erase it to defeat it. Behind her, Sterling stood alone before the glass, staring at the yacht he had renamed, the shipyard he had lost, and the sea that waited just beyond reach. Serena stepped into the evening light with her dignity intact, and the empire finally answered to the name Sterling had spent years underestimating. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.